Hello, fellow sick people on Zoom. Alrighty, I am trying to get Chrome to open so we can look at the slides. Yeah. Alrighty, so thanks all for being understanding about me needing to miss on Monday. I just really couldn't talk, so lecturing just wasn't gonna work. So hopefully folks got a chance to review the videos of the last time I taught this class. I'm gonna just skim over Freud to hit some of this stuff. And then we'll dive into humanistic. First, I'm gonna take just a sec, since a lot of you are on Zoom, to do a quick attendance, checking off the folks who are on Zoom, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. As I'm doing this, just a reminder that we do have class on Friday, but then there is no class next Monday, because it is fall break. So everyone can just enjoy a little downtime. Okay. Alrighty. So Freud was special. Freud had very interesting ideas. And as you saw, if you got a chance to watch the other video, Freud really began his clinical work. He was a neurologist by background. He began his clinical sort of what we would more think of therapy work, working with a guy named Joseph Breuer, who did hypnosis. And so hypnosis is where you put someone in a trance state. And while he did that, he would get people to open up about what was going on. And so Anna O, or Anna O, probably more likely, knowing that here is someone who's from France or Austria at the time. She had a lot going on. She had a case of what was then called hysteria. Now we might call a somatoform disorder. So basically, she had physical symptoms that were not physically explained. There was nothing like biologically wrong with her. Her stress was manifesting in this way. And so Anna O, her whole, she fell ill during a period of stress when her father was sick and she was nursing him back to health. And she had a whole bunch of physical symptoms. So she could not feel her right arm and leg. She had restrictions on her field of vision. She couldn't recognize people she'd always known. And she couldn't speak in German, which was her native language. She could only speak in English. So again, they were using hypnosis to treat her. So, and this, like, again, put people's barriers down and allowed them to be suggestible, allowed them to kind of open up a little bit more about things. And so while she was in this trance, Anna O revealed experiences and feelings that she had that she didn't even realize she had. And so they repeatedly hypnotized her, would have her talk about these events and feelings, and she would feel better. And so they called this the talking cure. And it's what became therapy. And so Freud, after this, is like, this is so interesting that there's stuff that's outside of the consciousness or the conscious state of Anna O. So where are these memories residing? And he came up with this idea of unconscious. So he said the feelings of which the patient is unaware and cannot express in their normal waking states are in the unconscious. So you'll see a lot of like pop culture things talk about the subconscious, but Freud never used that word. He talked about being unconscious, outside completely of conscious awareness. He also thought about conflict within the mind, intrapsychic conflict. He thought about defense mechanisms, things that keep the unconscious unconscious. And he thought that the prototype for all these defense mechanisms was repression. Basically, there's some force within our minds that presses down, gets rid of the things that might be hard to think about. So based on this, he came up with his theory of neurosis. He thought that all painful feelings, if denied proper expression, might come out in anxiety, in these physical symptoms like Anna O had. And so he came up with these components of your personality, the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is primitive and instinctual. It operates according to the pleasure principle, which is I want what I want and I want it now. This is called primary process thinking. The best descriptor of the id I've ever seen is to think of the id as Cookie Monster. So me want cookie, right? Me wants that. Just take it and gobble it up. The ego comes into the existence because of the inability of the id to completely eliminate tension by itself. So the ego serves as the individual's adaptive function. It mediates between those id needs and reality. In reality, we can't just go into Crumble Cookie and jump the counter and eat all the cookies like Cookie Monster, right? We have to have a little bit of decorum. And so that's what the ego does for us. Pretty good, you all can see there. The captions. It operates on the reality principle, so it delays gratification until the appropriate time and place after you buy the cookie at Crumble Cookie, right? And it engages in this secondary process thinking, which is rational, realistic, and problem-oriented. And again, I'm skimming this because hopefully y'all were able to review the videos. If you need more in depth, you can look at those links that I sent out on Monday. The superego is the moral component or the super moral. And this emerges from the ego around 3 to 5 years of age. And it has ideas about standards, both right and wrong. So the key points here is these all interact and sometimes kind of like fight with each other. And that produces behavior through these series of ongoing internal conflicts. Now, one thing that's really sort of an interesting side note about Freud is even though now we see him as unscientific, he really was trying to be scientific about the brain. He thought that his philosophy, his way of thinking was like, he called it psychodynamics because it was about dynamics in the brain. Like we have thermodynamics for physics. So he was trying to be scientific. This is just a diagram mapping it onto the brain. Freud never actually put these in parts of the brain. All right, I'm gonna skip through the little scenarios again, just because hopefully you were able to watch the videos. If not, you can go back. But I do want to spend a little bit of time focusing on fixation and regression. So fixation and regression are one of the things that Freud emphasizes about the importance of early childhood and navigating early childhood in a secure and good way. And so basically he said these first 5 years are really important for personality development, and if something goes wrong at any stage, you might get fixated there. So like part of your psychic consciousness stays there. And so these are Freud's psychosexual stages. One thing that I will say is that people came after Freud, a lot of them disagreed with him. And to be perfectly honest, this is the primary place they disagreed with him. A lot of people did not like that he focused so much on sex and the idea of sex in development. And so most people kind of strayed from this. So the first stage is the oral stage. You get pleasure through your mouth. And this like makes some intuitive sense, right? Because if you give a baby something, they're going to stick it in their mouth, right? So the key tasks are weaning, so transitioning to solid foods. The anal stage is all about toilet training. The idea is you get pleasure through the anus by retaining or expulsing feces. The phallic stage is the really fun one. This is the Oedipal complex, where boys are supposedly attracted to their mothers and hate their fathers because they view their dads as rival for mom's love. But boys fear that their dad will retaliate against them by castrating them, chopping off their penis, or maybe more sort of abstractly, the phallus. And that motivates them to put aside their desire for mom and identify with dad. And Freud argued that's when the superego develops. For girls, what Freud argued is that they realize during this stage they don't have a penis, they don't have the phallus, and they develop something called penis envy. Freud argued that girls then develop attraction for their father, and Freud just called this the Oedipal complex for girls too. His student Jung gave it a different name and called it the Electra complex. So Freud argued that grown women continue to have penis envy and never develop a strong superego, which leads them to rely more on emotion than reason. Freud argued when you turn 6, you've gone through this phallic stage, the Oedipal complex, you just kind of chill out for a while. He called this the latency stage. These are the school age years where kids are developing their skills and becoming more socialized. They tend to play with same-sex peers and avoid children of the opposite sex. Think about cooties, right? And then he argued that once you hit puberty, you enter what he called the genital phase. So your sexual drive returns. This is when you start to date and have sexual experiences. So Freud argued that there can be this fixation and regression that occurs under 2 different conditions. One is that if at a certain developmental stage you receive too much gratification, and the same problem could happen if you receive too little gratification. So if you receive too much, there's not really a motivation to move on. You're comfortable there. If you receive too little, you might develop some sort of disorder. Sometimes what might happen is the person's only like partially fixated at a stage. And then when they are under stress later in life, they might regress. And regression means going back to a previous stage. So let's say someone is fixated at that first stage, the oral stage. So what that means is that later in life, when they're under stress, they'll try to obtain the same type of satisfaction that worked for them at that earlier stage of development. So if you're partially fixated at the oral stage and you regress there, you might still try to seek oral gratifications, maybe overeating, binge drinking, smoking, biting your nails, chewing on pens, things like that. So again, regression is where you seek to return to an earlier mode of satisfaction. And again, this happens when you're stressed out. So fixation and regression are relative. It's not like you're going to totally turn back into a baby, right? People rarely fixate or regress completely. Rather, each person's personality tends to include some infantilisms, immature forms of behavior, and or predispositions, there we go, to display childish conduct when you're stressed out. So some examples here. Abraham and Kessler looked at personality traits depending on the needs of, in both portions of the oral stage, were satisfied or frustrated. So they divided the oral stage, again, all about the mouth, into sucking needs and biting needs. And they found personality characteristics that were related here. So people who had their sucking stage satisfied, they tended to be optimistic, dependent, generous, cheerful, sociable. The people who had the biting need satisfied were sadistic. Woohoo! Frustrated. If they were frustrated at the sucking stage, needs were not met. Then they were pessimistic, demanding, clingy, impatient, hostile, cruel. They might even show symptoms of anorexia nervosa. If they were frustrated at the biting substage, they might be jealous, hostile, malicious, sarcastic, and engaged in things like nail biting. All right, well, what about frustration at the anal stage? This is the one that has come the most into like our common sort of pop psych. Like we say, oh, that person's so anal. Like that refers to this stage. So the anal compulsive or anal retentive character type is known by a series of traits called the anal triad. So they're orderly and cleanly. They need to keep everything clean and in order. They have parsimony and stinginess. They want to hold on to things. And obstinacy. They're stubborn. They're defiant. These are kids who often refuse to cooperate with toilet training. So I don't know if folks are familiar with The Odd Couple. It's a play and a movie. But in The Odd Couple, there's one person who's just like messy all the time, and then the other person who's anal retentive or anal compulsive. And you can imagine the hijinks that ensue when you've got a very neat person living with a very messy person. All right, some criticisms of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. So there's a lot of complexity here. Maybe it's too complicated, people have argued. Freud's research was all based on case studies, as we talked about in chapter 2. Well, that's great. It's not the best way of doing long-term research. Freud had a lot of vague definitions. We usually want some nice, clear, operational definitions. Really hard to do it. Like, how do you measure psychic energy? Right? Untestability, you can't test a lot of this stuff with stats. You can't measure it. You can't disconfirm it. Freud considered males the norm, so there's a lot of sexism. And again, he was like, I don't know, maybe the Oedipal complex applies to women. And if you remember, I just mentioned penis envy. Freud thought that women, again, had this envy of men for having the penis. And he thought the only way for women to ever satisfy that was to give birth to a male child. Because then she has created a penis. Obviously, very sexist. Also, Freud rarely worked with kids. Basically, all his ideas was based on patients recalling their past. This can be called retrospective bias, where people aren't always accurate about what they say about their past. But he's still really influential, partially because he was one of the few theorists who tried to explain everything. Development, personality, abnormality, right? So people still love Freud. A couple other folks here. Anna Freud was Freud's true intellectual heir and actually his daughter. And she really expanded a lot on what her father had done. In particular, she applied what he did to children. She worked with children more than he did. She developed what's called a diagnostic profile, which was a framework used to organize and integrate the information obtained during your initial intake interview or diagnostic assessment. This would be like an intake report today. So we definitely still do this. Anna is the one who started this. She also talked about developmental lines, which are essentially the way that you develop. They're very psychodynamic or psychoanalytic. So for example, there's one from wetting and soiling to bladder and bowel control, thinking about the anal stage. She also noted when working with children that there are limits to environmental changes that can be made because kids don't have control over their environment, their parents, their teachers, everybody else does. She and pretty much everyone who came after Freud focused way more on the ego. Freud focused a lot on the id. And so she was the one who organized Freud's theories about defense mechanisms. He was just sort of like, yeah, those exist. And she actually wrote a book about it and talked about how the ego's defenses may be inferred from observable behavior. She also developed new ones, such as identification with the aggressor, which is where a victim may respond to their captor or aggressor with gratitude and admiration. We see this in prisoners of war and hostages. This is sometimes called Stockholm Syndrome. We also unfortunately see this in survivors of domestic violence. Karen Horney was really interesting. So she existed around the same time as Freud, but didn't think it was important to go meet him. And Freud hated that. He thought everyone who wanted to be a good psychoanalyst needed to essentially like come and visit him and be in his presence. And Horney was like, nah, I'm good. Horney was one of the first women to go to medical school. So she also was a psychiatrist. And so Horney, I should preface this with, unfortunately, she was brutally abused by her father growing up. And that context, I think, gives some light to her theories. So she talked about basic evil done to children by their parents. Right? I think for a lot of us, we would not relate to that. For Horney, it was like, this is what happened to me. So she talked about parental selfishness and disrespect. She talked about basic hostility, which is the rage activated in children by the basic evil. And that rage is directed at the parents. And that can be problematic because you are then destroying your relationship with the person you're dependent on, right? So it's a no-win situation. And as a result of that, she said, people develop basic anxiety, mistrust, shame, guilt, and inferiority. And she talked about the neurotic needs people developed as a result. These are rigid, inflexible, infused with hostility. And she talked about the tyranny of the shoulds, the idea that we should do something or we must do something. think about the list of all the things, maybe just today or for the rest of the week, that you have to do, right? I've got to get this done. And Horney said, how overwhelming is it if you allow yourself no flexibility, right? It can be like paralyzing. She hated Freud's idea of penis envy. Instead, she talked about almost like tongue-in-cheek womb envy. She said, well, okay, if you're saying women are jealous of the phallus, well, maybe men and boys are jealous about the female capacity to bear and nurse children. I mean, you're creating life. That's pretty badass, right? And that men respond indirectly to this jealousy by calling things related to the female body gross or taboo, right? In olden times, it might have been calling them witches, denying women equal rights, right? And so she talked about, you know, one of my favorite things Horney said is she said, my female patients aren't upset because they are jealous of having a phallus, right? They're jealous of men being able to like make their own way in their world, make money, be independent, right? She also talked about women's fear of success. And she said that a lot of women who are starting to break the mold fear that if they succeed, they might lose their friends. Carl Jung, quirky guy, as you can see from the picture, also quirky in his theories. So Carl Jung, to me, is sometimes more out there than Freud himself. Jung was very into Eastern mysticism and theology, and he came up with this idea of the collective unconscious. And he said, there are memories and ideas that all humans share, that somehow, somewhere in our brain, we're all connected, and we are sharing all these memories. The sum total of all human existence. And he gave some examples here in his archetypes. These are core ideas of how people think about the world, both consciously and unconsciously. Universal themes. He said that these are never fully known. Part of them just stays in the unconscious, but they're symbolized in our art, in our storytelling, in our dreams. And they're things we see over and over across different cultures. An Earth Mother, the hero myth, some sort of devil or evil figure, some sort of supreme being. So he said these represent a connection to the greater cosmic process. Some examples, the persona is the role we play in society. It is a mask we put on, he said, to get along in society. It's like, it doesn't represent who we really are. The shadow represents the unsociable, our taboo, our unacceptable thoughts. He said this is a necessary companion with the persona, and even though we hate it, we need the shadow to like balance out the persona. The anima is the feminine archetype. The animus is the masculine archetype. So the anima would be the feminine part of the male psyche. And he said this is about emotion and your ability to enter into relationships with people. The animus is the masculine part of the female psyche, and it's rational and analytical. Then he talked about the self, and the self strives to unify all these different parts of the personality. It directs the orderly distribution of all the psychic energies so that all the parts of the personality kind of get along and are represented appropriately. It's the center or the midpoint of your personality. And he said the development of the self is like ongoing. And he said you don't really fully develop it till you're like middle aged, so maybe your 40s or 50s. Alrighty, now we're going to get into humanistic theory of personality. This is a big contrast to psychodynamic theory. And in fact, most personality theories that came after Freud are written in contrast to Freud. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we study Freud, is because if he hadn't come up with everything, we might never have had these other theorists. So psychodynamic theory, the idea is that people are racked by id instincts and they're struggling to keep them in check. And they have all this intrapsychic conflict, right? Well, in contrast, humanistic theories oppose this bleak pessimism and despair inherent in that psychoanalytic view of the individual. They also oppose the almost robot-like conceptualization of people that's portrayed by the behaviorists we'll talk about later. The humanists are more hopeful and optimistic about the individual. They view the person essentially as a positive, social, trustful, and constructive being. And they believe that each person contains within themselves the potential for healthy and creative growth. So again, a very optimistic view of human personality, of human development. So a quote related to this from Carl Rogers, who we'll talk about on the next slide. Rogers said, "I have little sympathy with the rather prevalent concept that man is basically irrational and that his impulses, if not controlled, will lead to the destruction of others and self. Man's behavior is exquisitely rational, moving with subtle and ordered complexity toward the goals his organism is endeavoring to achieve." So again, he had no time for your psychodynamic shenanigans. He believed in a very positive view of people. So this is Rogers, and his theory of personality has three key structures. The first is the organism, and this is the individual's actual experience. So their actual experience. Everything that's potentially available to awareness that's going on within the individual at any given time. Within the organism is the individual's subjective reality, their frame of reference that can be known only to them. So in Rogers' theory, the individual's behavior is going to depend on this subjective reality because those are experiences that they're giving meaning to, and they're part of this organism. So this is what they call the phenomenal field. The phenomenal field is that subjective reality. Then we have the self, and to Rogers, this is the key structural component. According to Rogers, individuals give meaning to events or experiences that appear to be related to themselves. The self has a pattern of perceptions and meanings that we refer to as I, me, mine, myself. Rogers thought that although the self could be fluid and changeable, it always retained a patterned, coherent, integrated, and organized quality. And then there was the ideal self. This is who we'd like to be. The self-concept the individual would like to possess. This includes perceptions and related meanings that are highly valued by the individual and are potentially relevant to that concept of the self. One of the key things that Rogers talked about and focused on in therapy was incongruence. So incongruence is the opposite of the ideal self. It's when we have a discrepancy between the self and our experiences. So for example, a person might view themselves as, I'm someone who doesn't hate anybody, right? And then they find that person that just gets under their skin and they realize they do hate that person. This puts them in a state of incongruence. They don't know how to bring these two things together if their conception of themselves is non-hating and these feelings of hatred they're having. So a state of incongruence is one of tension and internal confusion. When in a state of incongruence, the individual is unaware of it, and they are therefore potentially vulnerable to anxiety. One situation where an individual might experience incongruence is where there's a discrepancy between the self and the experience. But you could also experience incongruence if there's a discrepancy between that phenomenal field or your subjective reality and the actual reality, the world as it really is, or if there's a discrepancy between that self and that ideal self that we just talked about. So since the organism is really trying to maintain their self-concept, the response to the state of incongruence is one of defense. And there are two defensive processes. One is denial, just like, nope, this is not a thing, this is not happening. They just deny that the incongruence exists. The more common one is distortion. And this allows the experience into awareness, but in a form that makes it consistent with the self. So if you think, I'm a good student, but you fail an exam, right? Ooh, you have incongruence. But you can pretty easily distort that. Instead of questioning yourself, you might attribute it to, well, the professor made the exam too difficult. The professor could not reasonably expect us to know that. So again, your two categories here are denial and distortion. Denial being, it just doesn't exist. Distortion being, I can sort of rationalize out of this. One of the things that humanist theorists in general talk about is the idea of self-actualization. That people are striving for congruence, and congruence is the opposite of incongruence, right? Congruence is when stuff actually matches up. And that congruence can be achieved when there's consistency between the self and your experience. With congruence, you'd have someone who's adjusted, mature, and fully functioning. Someone who's experiencing congruence is able to think realistically and accept the entire range of their experience without denial, without distortion. And they don't feel threatened or anxious. Moreover, only those with congruence can get towards self-actualization, which is just a really fancy way of saying being the best you can be. And so another humanist theorist who really focused in on this idea of self-actualization was Abraham Maslow. Maslow is also a humanistic psychologist, and he addressed some of the different kinds of challenges to being congruent, having sort of a rational personality, being adjusted. But his most lasting contribution to psychology, which you may have seen before, is its hierarchy of needs. And so Maslow ranked human needs in the following order. You start at the bottom of the pyramid, and you have to satisfy the needs at one level before you can move up. Physiological needs are food, sleep, sensory stimulation. Maslow put sex here. And then other requirements of the body and the nervous system. Very basic, you need this to operate as a biological organism, right? If you don't have food, if you don't have water, right, you can't focus on anything else. I guess I have to run across the hall and grab a tissue because my nose is, I'll be right back. Thanks for your patience there. All right, so those are the physiological needs. Safety needs are the next step up. This is the assurance of order and predictability in the environment. It's the removal of environmental threats. It's psychological security, feeling like you're out of danger. Next is belongingness and love. These are things like love, friendship, affection from others, being a member of a group, being accepted by other people. And again, Maslow said you need to satisfy each of these before you can move up. So if you are spending all your time and energy just trying to find food, right? You're not going to be able to self-actualize. Esteem needs include recognition and appreciation from others of what you can do, leading to confidence in your own abilities and independence. So it's feeling confident, feeling approval, feeling recognition from your peers. And then self-actualization is the goal. It is being all you can be, realizing your unique capabilities. And each type of need, again, has to be reasonably satisfied before the next can be tackled. So the key point here is that optimum adjustment, optimum existence occurs when the person has satisfied those first 4 categories of needs sufficiently to move on to self-actualization. Now, one of the really interesting things about Maslow, again, just like Horney, it's important to kind of think about their background, is that Maslow himself was very interested in defining the self-actualized individual. He studied the lives and personalities of individuals, living and dead, whom he felt had self-actualized, had made extraordinary use of their potential. He was almost like obsessed with this. And he made a roster of 48 individuals he said had got to the point of self-actualization. So to Maslow, self-actualization was really hard to get to. It was rare that you would actually achieve it. So here are some of his examples: Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt. So interesting. What did all these people have in common? Well, this is what Maslow actually wrote about in his book, Motivation and Personality. So he came up with 15 characteristics that he found typical of these people who had reached self-actualization. One of these is acceptance of yourself and other people. You accept yourself and others as they are, rather than wishing them to change or be otherwise. You have a high value on the individuality and uniqueness of yourself and other people. Accurate perceptions of reality, seeing things as they are, without shying away from painful or unpleasant realities. Intimacy with others. This doesn't necessarily have to be sexual intimacy. It can be friendship intimacy. So having a few close friendships in which you reveal yourself fully. These folks probably don't have a lot of casual acquaintances that they reveal themselves in because they value their privacy and autonomy. And that's actually the next one, is personal autonomy. These folks tend to be highly self-sufficient. They have the strength to stand alone if necessary and to stick by their own inner judgment, even when others disagree. They tend to be very problem-centered. They have a mission in life. They have the sense that they have something to do, a goal, and they make decisions on the basis of life goals, even if it means temporary sacrifice. Also, spontaneity. Spontaneous and simple, they respond to life in like an effortless way. Some other characteristics here, that need for privacy. They're not going to be sort of blabbing things all over. Appreciation of the new, enjoying learning new things and not being sort of stuck in old ways. And mystical sense of unity with nature and humankind. It almost kind of pulls back to Jung a little bit. Feeling of brotherhood, personhood with all people. Creativity. Seeing other people as individuals and not categorizing them. Clear ideas of what is right and what is wrong. A sense of humor. I love that one's on there. And the ability to resist cultural standards that run counter to their personal standards. Many of these folks on the list were writing, talking about things that were ahead of their time, right? So like, for example, if anyone's seen the movie Oppenheimer, Einstein really believed we should not be trying to make these atomic bombs, right? That this is like a misappropriation of this. And people didn't like that he was saying that. So what do the data tell us about this? So according to Maslow, it's really hard to be self-actualized. Only 1% of the population gets there. And so we are able to see these things in very sort of structured different ways. And I'm going to stop there for today. And on Friday, we'll wrap up personality. We'll have another activity and we'll talk about social cognitive perspective. Thank you all again for being patient with your very, very under the weather professor.